The strange thing about my husband's funeral wasn't the silence. It was the weight of a single piece of paper. I was standing beside Harold Beckett's casket, one hand resting on the polished mahogany edge. Not because I wanted to say goodbye, but because I didn't know how to stand without something to hold on to. 42 years. That number kept cycling through my mind, the way a song gets stuck, not the melody you want, but the one that won't leave. 42 years of shared coffee and shared arguments and shared silences that felt like the most comfortable thing in the world. 3 days ago, Harold had been sitting at our kitchen table in that blue and white striped pajama shirt I had been trying to throw away since 2003, reading the sports section out loud to absolutely no one, saying they're paying that man $5 million a year to stand there and look disappointed, and then glancing up and catching me watching him and smiling the way he had been smiling at me since we were both 25 years old. Nothing special about that moment. That's exactly why I couldn't stop thinking about it. Now he was lying in a mahogany casket at Harmon and Sons Funeral Home on the north side of Portland, Oregon, on a gray October morning with his navy tie straight against his chest. I had tied that tie for him at our daughter's wedding 15 years ago. He had fumbled with it 3 times and finally held it out to me with that expression men get when they know they're beaten. I tied it in 11 seconds. He told everyone at the reception that I had done it in 4. The way he told that story, you would have thought I had performed surgery. He had a gift for turning ordinary moments into things worth keeping. I almost smiled at the memory, almost. The funeral home smelled of lilies and polished wood and the particular kind of quiet that buildings absorb when too much grief passes through them over too many years. People filled the rows behind me. Harold's business partners, old neighbors, men he had worked alongside for decades, men who had helped him build Beckett Construction Group from a rented truck and 2 borrowed ladders into one of the most respected construction companies in the Pacific Northwest. I heard their voices in low murmurs behind me, but I couldn't make out the words. Everything sounded like it was coming from a great distance, from a world that was still operating normally, while mine had stopped 3 days ago and not yet figured out how to restart. I was still holding myself together when Owen appeared at my side. He didn't announce himself. He didn't tap my shoulder or say my name. My 11-year-old grandson simply materialized beside me, the way children do when they move through a crowd without being noticed. And he pressed a folded piece of paper into my palm with the quiet, deliberate care of someone completing a task they had been rehearsing for a long time. He didn't look at me when he did it. He whispered barely loud enough to reach me through the organ music still fading in the air. Grandpa told me to give this to you, only if he didn't wake up. Then he stepped back and was gone before I could react. I stood completely still for 3 full seconds. Then, shielding my hands with my body and the angle of my coat, I unfolded the paper. The handwriting was Harold's. I would have known it across a room in poor lighting. Big, straight, deliberate letters, the handwriting of a man who had signed thousands of contracts and never once rushed his signature. But this time the pen had pressed harder than usual, hard enough to leave slight ridges in the paper that I could feel under my fingertips, as if the hand that wrote it had been working against something, resisting something, trying to make the words permanent in a way that ordinary writing doesn't need to be. Marge, don't trust Clifton. Don't go home with them tonight. Call Frank Aldridge. He's already waiting. My hands started shaking before I finished the second sentence. I folded the paper again, slipped it into the inside pocket of my purse, and pressed the clasp shut. My fingers were unsteady. I took one slow breath and made myself look forward at Harold's face, at the too perfect stillness of a man who had never been still a single day in his life. He looked like a very accurate portrait of himself. like someone had studied Harold carefully and reproduced him without quite capturing the thing that had made him Harold. I had 30 seconds of quiet before Clifton appeared at my elbow. My son was 44 years old, 6 feet tall, and wearing a black suit that had clearly been made for him by someone who charged more for it than they should have. He had Harold's jawline and my father's eyes and a way of arranging his face in public that Harold had once called with no particular affection his boardroom expression. Not unkind, not angry, precisely calibrated somewhere between grief and control, like a man who had prepared for this moment and wanted to get it right. "Mom," he said, placing his hand on my elbow, "you've been standing a long time. Let me take you to your seat." "I'm fine." "You don't look fine." His voice was gentle. His concern seemed genuine. But I noticed something in the next 3 seconds that I filed away carefully. His eyes did not go to my face when he spoke. They went to my hands, specifically to my purse, which I had just closed. It was a small thing, the kind of thing you could explain away a dozen different ways. I was aware of that. I filed it anyway. I let him guide me toward the front pew. As we walked, I made myself observe without appearing to observe. Clifton checked his watch once in the first 5 minutes of sitting down, then again 4 minutes later, then a third time during the opening hymn. The watch was Harold's old Seiko that Clifton had inherited 10 years ago, a deliberate, sentimental choice for today. But the checking of it was not sentimental. Sandra, his wife, sat 2 rows behind us, and her eyes moved in a pattern I recognized as monitoring, not grieving. She was tracking Clifton, then tracking Renee, then coming back to Clifton. Warren Allgate, my son-in-law, sat beside Renee with his arms crossed, and his jaw set the posture of a man who was waiting for something specific to happen and was not yet certain it would. None of them looked the way people look when someone they loved has just died. They look the way people look when a plan is in motion and they are waiting to find out whether it will work. I told myself I was being paranoid. Grief does strange things to perception. It makes ordinary behavior look sinister, turns neutral gestures into evidence, transforms the familiar into the suspect. Families were always uncomfortable at funerals. People checked their watches. People looked nervous. I told myself all of that, and I almost believed it until Pastor Glenn Whitfield approached me after the service ended. Whitfield was 58 years old with silver hair and the particular warmth of a man who had conducted enough funerals to know exactly what to say and exactly how to say it. He took my hand in both of his and spoke with practiced sincerity about Harold's generosity, about the community he had built, about the peace that comes in time. He was good at his job, and I appreciated him for it. And then in the same warm, measured voice, he said, "Clifton mentioned you'd be staying with them for a few days. A wise choice, Mrs. Beckett. An empty house is a hard thing in a time like this." I kept my expressions soft and grateful. I thanked him. I moved on. But the sentence stayed with me. Clifton had already told the pastor where I would be sleeping. He had arranged my immediate future as a settled matter and communicated it to people in Harold's social circle before asking me a single word about it. That was not the behavior of a son concerned about his mother. That was the behavior of someone establishing a narrative, creating social confirmation for a plan already in motion. At the gravesite, I stood between Clifton on my left and a cluster of Harold's longtime employees on my right, men in their 50s and 60s with calloused hands and decent suits. Men who had driven to the cemetery on a Wednesday morning because Harold Beckett had employed them for decades and treated them like human beings rather than line items. I watched one of them, a project foreman named Pete, who had worked for Harold since the company had 12 people, press his hand briefly to the side of the casket as it was lowered. His shoulders shook once. He didn't look around to see if anyone noticed. That gesture told me more about what Harold had built than any number of financial documents ever could, and I felt the grief rise in my chest so sharply I had to press my lips together and look at the sky for a moment before I could breathe through it. Owen stood apart from his parents during the service. He had positioned himself at the edge of the group, his hands jammed deep into the pockets of his coat, and he was watching me with the patient, contained expression of someone much older than 11. When our eyes met, he gave me a small, deliberate nod, the nod of someone confirming a task completed. Something tightened in my chest. Dorothy Ainsworth found me near the cemetery gate as the service concluded. Dot was 74, a widow herself for 11 years, a woman who had lived 3 houses down from us for 2 decades and had brought us dinner every time one of us was sick and never once asked for anything in return. She was wearing a purple scarf Harold had teased her about at a block party 4 years ago, saying it made her look like she was announcing herself from a distance, and she had laughed and said that was precisely the intention. She pressed her phone into my hand without a word of explanation. She just held it out, looked at me steadily, and said, "Take as long as you need, honey. I'm not going anywhere." I walked to the far side of a large oak tree, put my back to the crowd, and dialed the number that had been printed on Harold's business cards for longer than I could remember. It rang 3 times. "Frank Aldridge speaking." The voice was deep and steady, the voice of a man who had been practicing calm for 7 decades and had gotten very good at it. Franklin Aldridge had been Harold's attorney for nearly as long as Harold had been running the company. He had handled contracts, disputes, expansions, the legal architecture of everything Harold had built. If Harold trusted anyone outside our marriage with the things that mattered, it was Frank. "Frank," I said, "it is Marjorie Beckett." There was a pause, not long, but it was the pause of a man shifting registers, moving from professional to something more urgent, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed in a way that told me he had been expecting this call and had not known whether it would come. "Marjorie, are you safe right now? Not, 'I'm sorry for your loss.' Not, 'How are you holding up?' Not, 'This must be such a difficult day.'" The first thing Frank Aldridge asked on the day of my husband's funeral was whether I was safe. "I'm at the cemetery," I said. "Good. Listen carefully." He told me Harold had come to see him 3 days before his hospitalization. Not for estate planning, as Harold had told me. Harold had come carrying a manila folder and a small black USB drive, and he had sat down across from Frank's desk and laid both items on the surface with the flat-palmed, methodical precision of a man who had decided that careful presentation was more important than speed. Frank said Harold had organized everything in sequence, that he had wanted Frank to understand the progression of what he had found rather than simply jumping to conclusions. That he had come like a man presenting a case, not a man in distress. "He told me he had been watching certain things for about 6 weeks," Frank said. "He told me someone had been pressuring him to sign documents he had refused to sign. And he told me he had started wondering why his heart condition had gotten noticeably worse over the previous 2 weeks when there had been no change in his treatment or lifestyle." I was quiet. "That was the part that worried me most," Frank continued. "Harold wasn't frightened. He was thorough. And a thorough man who has decided to document something rather than confront it directly has already made a very specific calculation about what he is dealing with." "Did he tell you not to trust Clifton?" I asked. There was a brief silence. "He told me not to trust either of them. Either of them. Not Clifton alone. Clifton and Renee both. I had to work to keep my breathing even." My daughter, Renee, who had sat in our kitchen for 100 Sunday dinners and called her father every week, and been the person Harold called when he needed to talk through a problem, because she had his way of thinking, systematic and patient. Harold had spent months watching her and saying nothing to me, carrying that particular weight on top of everything else, still hoping at every stage that he was wrong about her. There's more, Frank said. There's something he prepared for you. Documents, evidence, but I need you to understand something first. Tell me, whatever they want you to sign tonight or tomorrow, don't sign it. I don't care how routine they say it is. I don't care what deadlines they describe or what consequences they suggest will follow from delay. You wait. And tonight you meet me. He gave me the name of a diner, a place Harold had mentioned to me once years ago as somewhere he occasionally stopped after late meetings. Marlowe's 9:30. Come alone. And Marjorie. Yes. Don't go home with Clifton. Harold was very specific about that. Those were his exact words. He ended the call. I stood with Dot's phone in my hand for a moment, looking at my own faint reflection in the dark screen. Pale, tired. Older than I had felt yesterday morning, younger somehow than I would have expected, given what I was carrying. When I turned back toward the group, Clifton and Renee were both scanning the cemetery. They were not looking around the way people do when they're simply trying to locate someone. They were searching with the focused, slightly urgent attention of people who had expected to know where I was and had suddenly found that they didn't, and who found that uncertainty significant. Warren stood beside their car with his phone in his hand, his eyes moving in my direction. I walked back toward the group and accepted a hug from Pete the foreman, who said in a low voice that Harold had been the best man he had ever worked for and meant every syllable of it. I thanked him genuinely. Then I accepted Clifton's hand on my arm and let him walk me to the cars, and I kept my face soft and my posture tired, which required very little performance because the exhaustion underneath was entirely real. The reception was held at St. Andrew's Community Hall, a comfortable room with long tables and decent coffee, and the warm hum of people who had come to pay genuine respects. I moved slowly through the space, accepting condolences, thanking people for coming, listening to stories about Harold that made me want to laugh and cry simultaneously. He had apparently been telling people for years that he had built the company with nothing but hard work and common sense, conveniently omitting the $15,000 my father had loaned him in 1982, which Harold had paid back with interest in a bottle of scotch, and the assertion that the scotch cost more than the interest and should count for something. He had also apparently told anyone who would listen that his wife had the finest instincts for people of anyone he had ever met. I heard that from 3 separate people that afternoon. Standing in that room knowing what I now knew, I thought, Harold, you could have just told me. Warren found me first. He brought 2 cups of coffee, which was a thoughtful gesture, and he handed one to me with the easy manner of a man who had spent years learning how to be likable in rooms where being likable mattered. Warren Allgate was 43 years old, self-made in a way that Harold had genuinely respected a man who had built his way up through commercial real estate before marrying Renee and gradually inserting himself into conversations about Beckett Construction's future in ways that had seemed at the time like natural curiosity. He was a practical man, Warren said after we had exchanged the expected words about Harold. He understood that businesses need continuity. He did, I agreed. There are some operational documents we need to move on fairly quickly, just to keep things stable while the estate process gets sorted. Warren's voice stayed casual, the tone of someone raising a minor logistical matter at a convenient moment. The investors are in a holding pattern. Clifton thinks it's best to address it sooner rather than later. Which investors? I asked. He paused, just slightly, just enough to confirm that the question had surprised him. The ones working with Clifton on the expansion. Harold never mentioned an expansion. He was getting there, Warren said. His hand around his coffee cup had tightened fractionally, the only visible sign that this conversation was not going the way he had scripted it. Sometimes men don't want to worry their wives with every business detail, especially when things are still in development. I looked at him over my cup. Harold worried me with every detail, I said. That was the deal we had, 35 years of it. He worried me with things I didn't need to know, and then I helped him think through them. That was how we worked. I set my cup down on a nearby table. I'll think about it tomorrow, Warren. Something moved behind his eyes, brief and contained but present. He covered it immediately with a smile that was technically identical to the one he had arrived with. But I had been watching people for 67 years, and I had seen what was under it. Clifton came to me 20 minutes later with a different approach, softer and more familial, framing the documents as something Harold himself would have wanted, handled quickly, as a way of honoring what Harold had built by keeping it intact in the transition. I said tomorrow, Clifton, with a tired smile, and this time I did not elaborate or apologize for my decision. I simply stated it and held it. His expression shifted in a way he did not intend me to see. He had expected me to explain myself, to offer the gentle negotiation of a woman who was overwhelmed and looking for reassurance. My refusal to provide that negotiation landed differently than he had planned for. I found Owen near the dessert table. He was standing with the studied casualness of a child who wants very much to appear as though he is simply eating cookies and not waiting for something important. When I approached, he glanced once toward his father across the room, then leaned slightly in my direction. "Did you read it?" he whispered. "Yes." His shoulders dropped an inch, the specific physical relaxation of someone who has been carrying a responsibility and has just been permitted to set it down. "Grandpa said you'd understand it," he told me. Then, after a moment, as if deciding that partial information was no longer sufficient, he made me memorize something. He said it 3 times so I would remember it exactly. He said if she calls Mr. Aldridge, everything changes by morning. "What else did he tell you?" Owen was quiet for a moment, working through his answer with the same methodical seriousness he brought to everything. "I heard Dad yelling at him once," he said finally. "In the office, he wanted Grandpa to sign something and Grandpa said no." A pause. "Dad said he was making things harder than they needed to be." "What did Grandpa say back?" Owen looked up at me, and for a moment his face was so much like Harold's that it cost me something to hold his gaze steadily. He said, "I built this. I know what it's worth." I squeezed Owen's hand once briefly and straightened up. Across the room, Clifton was watching us, not his son's face and not mine. He was watching our hands and the space between us, trying to read a conversation he could not hear. Sandra reached me a few minutes later, carrying my purse, which I had left on a chair near the entrance. She brought it over with a warm smile and set it on the table beside me with careful, gentle hands. But before she released it, her fingers rested on the clasp for a single moment, and her eyes moved from the bag to my face with an expression that lasted less than 2 seconds and told me nothing I could name with certainty. Only that she had noticed something and was paying attention to something specific and was deciding how to hold that information. I thanked her. She squeezed my arm and moved away. I watched her go and wondered what she knew and when she had known it and whether it was the same thing I was beginning to understand. The drive home was quiet. Harold's silver sedan moved through the Portland suburbs as the October light faded from gray to early dark, and I let muscle memory handle the familiar streets while my mind worked through everything I had observed, everything Frank had told me, the weight of the note still in my purse. I went inside and walked directly to Harold's study. The door was slightly ajar. Harold always closed it completely when he finished working, always without exception, every single time for 30 years. He said an open door was an invitation, and he didn't issue invitations to his workspace without deciding to. I pushed it open slowly. The room looked ordinary. Bookshelves lined with construction codes and legal references in the three Tom Clancy novels he had read so many times the spines were held together with habit rather than binding. The large oak desk facing the window, the small lamp in the corner that he preferred to the overhead light because, as he told me approximately 400 times over the years, overhead light was designed for factories and interrogations, and he was doing neither. I crossed to the desk and looked down at the bottom drawer. It was open, not much, perhaps 2 inches. But Harold closed every drawer completely every time, a habit from 40 years of managing documents in an organized system, and the gap was as obvious to me as a missing floorboard would have been to someone who had walked the same hallway for 3 decades. I knelt and pulled the drawer fully open. The folders inside had been moved, not dramatically, not with any carelessness, but in the slight way that happens when someone tries very hard to replace things exactly and doesn't quite succeed because they were looking for something specific rather than memorizing a precise arrangement. And between two folders where another folder should have been there was a gap, a deliberate absence, something taken. I stood slowly pressing one hand to the edge of the desk to steady myself and looked around the room. Then I saw the planner. Harold kept a personal day planner in the right corner of his desk. He had used one every year since 1978, small black notebooks with the year stamped on the cover in gold. He filled them with meetings and appointments and notes to himself in his precise, heavy handwriting, and he transferred information from the previous year's planner to the new one every January 1st, a ritual he treated with the seriousness other people reserved for New Year's resolutions. I had teased him about it for decades. In an age of phones and computers and digital calendars with automatic reminders, my husband maintained his schedule in a paper book with a ballpoint pen. He said paper didn't require charging and couldn't be hacked. The planner was open. It was not usually open on the desk when Harold was done for the day. I picked it up carefully and turned to the page that was showing. 4 days before Harold was hospitalized. 2 entries in darker ink than the surrounding pages pressed harder into the paper, as if the act of writing them required more force than usual. 3 p.m. call pharmacy about refill. Then below it, check security footage. Something is not right. And at the bottom corner of the page, in smaller letters that had been added afterward, the ink slightly different in shade, Owen knows what to do. He had trusted an 11-year-old boy with the most important message he had ever needed to send. Not because there was no one else, because Owen was the only person in that house who had nothing to gain from silence and no reason to choose anyone's interest over his grandmother's. I set the planner down and straightened up. My phone buzzed in my purse, and I already knew who it was before I looked. Clifton's voice, when she answered, was controlled and warm, and faintly concerned, the voice of a devoted son checking on a grieving mother. He asked if I had gotten home safely. He asked if I was eating. Then, almost as an afterthought, wrapped in the same considerate tone, "Have you given any more thought to the paperwork? It really would just take a few minutes and I could come over tonight if that would be easier for you." "I'm not thinking clearly tonight," I told him. My voice came out tired and soft, which required no effort at all because the exhaustion underneath it was completely genuine. "I just need to be here with his things." "I understand," he said, "but the timing really does matter with these things. A few days can make a significant difference." "Tomorrow, Clifton." A pause, long enough to tell me he was working out whether to push further and concluding correctly that pushing further tonight would not serve him. "Okay, Mom, but call me if you need anything. Anytime, we're here." After we hung up, a second message arrived. Not from Clifton, from Frank Aldridge, an address and a time in the plane efficient shorthand of a man who had been careful about what he committed to written communication for half a century. Marlowe's Diner, 9:30. I looked at the clock. 2.5 hours. I went to the kitchen and made coffee the way Harold always made it, which meant stronger than any reasonable person would consider necessary. Then I sat at the kitchen table in the chair across from the one where he always sat, and I held the mug with both hands and looked at the space where he should have been. He had known. He had seen it coming with enough clarity to prepare for it systematically, to build protections, to leave a paper trail and a USB drive, and a note with a child who would not be suspected of carrying anything important. And he had still gotten up every morning and sat at this table and argued about the trailblazers and made terrible coffee and handed me the sports section with a running commentary because that was Harold, a man who could hold a terrible knowledge in one hand and keep the ordinary day going with the other, because he understood that the ordinary day was also worth protecting. What had he been carrying that last morning? When he pushed the newspaper across to me and said something about the point spread, what had he already decided and not said? I finished the coffee, rinsed the mug, turned off the kitchen light. Then I picked up my purse, took out the note one more time, and read it again in the dim hallway light before putting it back. Don't trust Clifton. Don't go home with them tonight. Call Frank Aldridge. He's already waiting. He had been waiting. For months, apparently. Waiting to find out whether Harold's fears would prove founded, or whether everything would somehow resolve itself the way Harold had hoped it might. The fears had proven founded. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. 2 houses down the Murphys had their porch light on. Somewhere a few streets over, a dog barked twice and stopped. An ordinary Tuesday evening in a suburb of Portland, Oregon, with the ordinary sounds of people living their ordinary lives, and me standing in the hallway of my 30-year home, preparing to drive to a diner and learn what my husband had been afraid of before he died. I locked the front door behind me and walked to Harold's car. The engine turned over on the first try. It still ran perfectly. The diner had 11 customers when I walked in at 9:26. I counted them without meaning to, the way you count things when part of your mind is running a separate calculation underneath everything else you're doing. Frank Aldridge was in the last booth against the back wall, sitting with his hands folded on the table and a cup of coffee in front of him that he hadn't touched. He was 72 years old and looked every year of it. Tonight, silver-haired and deliberate, wearing a dark overcoat he had not taken off despite the warmth of the room. His leather briefcase sat on the seat beside him with the careful placement of something that contained things that mattered. When he saw me come through the door, he stood. Not out of politeness, out of something closer to relief. "Did anyone follow you?" he asked before I had fully settled into the seat across from him. "I check my mirrors most of the way here." He nodded slowly and looked toward the entrance once before sitting back down. The waitress, a woman about my age named Linda, whose name tag was slightly crooked, filled a second mug without being asked. Frank thanked her by name and waited until she was 12 feet away before he leaned forward slightly and began. 3 weeks before Harold went to the hospital, he said he came to my office. He told my assistant he wanted to review some estate documents. That's what he told her. What he actually did was set a manila folder and a USB drive on my desk and say, "Frank, I want to show you something, and I need you to tell me if I'm being paranoid." I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug. Was he? No, Frank said. He was not. He opened his briefcase and removed a slim laptop, setting it between us, with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done this before, who had sat across from people in difficult moments and learned that the fastest path through them was simply to show the truth and let it do its work. He came to me the way he ran his business, Frank continued, methodically. He had organized everything in sequence. He wanted me to understand the progression of what he had found, not just the conclusion. And he told me something before he opened the folder that I haven't been able to stop thinking about. A brief pause. He said, "I've been hoping I was wrong about this. I need you to tell me if the evidence makes that hope reasonable." Was it? No, Frank said. It was not. He opened a folder on the laptop screen. A video file. He pressed play. The footage was grainy in the way that indoor security cameras tend to be. The color, slightly off the timestamp, burned into the lower right corner in white numerals. It showed the interior of Harold's home office, the bookshelves. I knew the oak desk, the small lamp in the corner. The date in the corner was 3 weeks earlier, a Saturday afternoon. The office door opened. Clifton walked in, glanced briefly at the doorway behind him, and closed the door. He was wearing the gray weekend clothes he favored on Saturdays, which told me this had been a weekend visit. One of the visits he had been making with increasing frequency over the past several months. The ones I had thought were simply a son wanting to spend more time with his aging father during a difficult period. Clifton walked directly to the desk, not to the chair, not to the bookshelves, to the desk. He opened the top drawer, looked through it with practiced efficiency, closed it, opened the second drawer, closed it, opened the third, spent longer on the third, closed it. Then he moved to the bottom drawer, the one I had found slightly open tonight, and worked through it with the focused attention of someone who knows exactly what they are looking for and is frustrated not to find it. There was nothing random or exploratory in his movements. He had been here before, in his mind at least, and had a clear map of where the thing he wanted should be. He did not find it. After 4 minutes and 11 seconds, he straightened up, looked around the room once more, and left. Frank paused the video. I looked at the frozen image of my son standing in my husband's private office in a house he had visited under the pretense of family connection, searching through a living man's desk while the man was still alive downstairs. He came back, Frank said. He opened a second file. Different date, 2 weeks after the first, same room. This time it was Renee who came through the door. She moved more carefully than Clifton had. She closed the door with both hands to control the sound. She crossed to the desk with the measured steps of someone who had thought about this beforehand, who had a specific plan and intended to execute it cleanly. She opened the bottom drawer and extracted a single folder, opened it, and read. Not everything. She was looking for something specific, moving her eyes down the pages in the scanning pattern of someone checking whether a particular item was still present. After roughly 2 minutes, she replaced the folder, adjusted its position with 2 careful fingertips, ensuring it was exactly as she had found it, and left. She had not taken anything. She had checked whether something was still there. I watched the door close behind my daughter on a security camera, recording in a booth in a diner in Portland, Oregon, and I did not speak for 15 seconds. 15 seconds is a long time to be completely silent in a room with another person. Frank let the silence stand without filling it. Harold reviewed the footage himself, Frank said. He had installed the cameras 2 years ago after a break-in attempt while you were visiting your sister. He told me he had almost never looked at the recordings because nothing had happened since then. He paused. Until it did. When did he know for certain? I asked. He suspected for about 6 weeks before he came to me. He confirmed it when he pulled the footage and when he added everything else he had been collecting alongside it. 6 weeks. Harold had watched his son search his desk and his daughter check his files and had said nothing to me for 6 weeks, sitting at the breakfast table every morning in that striped pajama shirt, commenting on the sports section, carrying this knowledge with the discipline of a man who had decided that acting prematurely would cost more than it gained. Play the audio, I said. Frank opened a third file. No video this time, just a dark screen and 2 voices. Harold's voice came first, and the sound of it hit me somewhere behind the sternum in a way I had not anticipated. Even on a recording, even through laptop speakers in a room full of other people's noise, it was unmistakably his. The particular register of a man who is keeping his voice level because he has decided that losing his temper would be less useful than staying controlled. I'm not signing that. Clifton's voice followed, tighter, prepared but not quite adequate to the resistance it was meeting. You're being stubborn, Dad. I'm being careful. You're slowing everything down. Then tell me exactly what I'm slowing down. Silence. The silence of a man who had prepared his answer and found in the moment of being asked directly that it would not hold up to scrutiny. A longer pause than Clifton had planned for. The expansion, Clifton said finally, the expansion doesn't require this paperwork. You wouldn't understand the details. Harold's response came without pause, without heat, in the flat tone of someone correcting a factual error in a meeting. I built this company. I understand every detail. Another silence. Longer, then Clifton, his voice dropping into something that was not quite a threat, but sat uncomfortably close to one. You're making things harder than they need to be. Harold, after a moment, harder than they need to be, or harder than you planned for. Frank closed the audio file. I sat with that question hanging in the air above the diner table. Harold had seen it coming clearly enough to record it. He had been precise enough to understand the difference between making something difficult and disrupting a plan that had never consulted him. There's more, Frank said. He reached into the briefcase and produced a printed document. Single page placed flat on the table between us. It was a contract, an emergency authority transfer agreement, a document that would give Clifton legal authority to execute corporate decisions on behalf of Beckett Construction Group. At the bottom, a signature line, and on that line in ink, the name Harold Beckett. I looked at it for 4 seconds before I understood what was wrong. Harold's signature was one of the most consistent things about him. 40 years of signing contracts had produced a signature as reliable and individual as a fingerprint. The capital H with its particular leftward lean, the double curve of the B, the way the final letters trailed into a line that angled precisely 2 degrees downward. I had watched him sign things hundreds of times at kitchen tables and conference rooms and closing ceremonies and my father's dining room table in 1982. I knew his signature the way I knew the sound of his key in the front lock. The signature on this document had been produced by someone working from a model. The angles were slightly wrong. The pressure was uneven in ways that Harold's pressure never was. The final trail angled 3 degrees downward instead of 2. Someone had tried to replicate Harold's signature and had come very close. But close was not the same as correct, and Harold had apparently noticed before the document was finalized and acted on. He caught it, Frank confirmed. He brought this to me as Exhibit A. He didn't know yet who had physically produced it, but he knew what had been attempted, and he knew it told him something definitive about what he was dealing with. Forgery, I said. Attempted forgery, yes. There's one more thing, Frank said. He reached into the briefcase again, and this time produced a printed email chain. He set it beside the contract without comment and let me look. The email at the top was from Dr. Alan Prescott, Harold's cardiologist, addressed to Frank and dated 4 days before Harold's hospitalization. Dr. Prescott wrote that he had been informed through a pharmacy inquiry he had initiated after a patient flag that a refill of Harold's cardiac medication had been dispensed with an adjusted dosage. He had not authorized this adjustment. He had not been consulted about it. He was writing to confirm for the legal record that no dosage modification had been recommended or approved by his office at any point in the previous 6 months. Beside the email, Frank placed a pharmacy receipt, a printed copy clear and legible. The medication was Harold's. The dosage was double his standard prescription. And at the bottom of the receipt on the line for the person who had collected the order was a signature. Warren Aldgate. I set the email and the receipt side by side on the table and looked at them together. My son-in-law had picked up my husband's heart medication at double the standard dose on a prescription that Harold's own cardiologist had never authorized. Harold's heart had been struggling already. The additional burden had shown up in the ways Frank had described, the sudden worsening in the weeks before he collapsed, the deterioration that had struck everyone who knew him as unexpected. They needed him weak, I said. Not a question, not a conclusion I was working toward. A thing I already knew, stated plainly because plainness was what the moment required. That's what Harold believed, Frank said carefully. He was right. Frank did not argue. He closed the laptop and folded his hands on the table and gave me the silence I needed to let the full weight of it settle into something I could carry forward rather than be stopped by. My husband had been methodically weakened by someone with access to his pharmacy in the weeks when he was refusing to sign documents that would have handed his company to the people doing the weakening. And then he had collapsed, and then he had died, and then his family had stood around his casket in their good clothes with their rehearsed expressions and waited to see whether the plan would survive his absence. Frank, I said, yes, I want to confront Clifton tonight. He looked at me steadily. I know you do. He deserves to hear it directly from me. He does, Frank said, but if you confront him tonight, he will spend the next 12 hours destroying whatever evidence is still accessible. Emails, financial records, anything he hasn't already secured. He leaned forward slightly. I'm asking you to give me until tomorrow morning, 12 hours. 12 hours while he thinks his plan is still moving forward. Yes, I understood what he was asking me to carry for the next 12 hours. He was asking me to drive home, answer Clifton's calls if he made them perform the part of the overwhelmed widow who was getting there, who would probably sign in the morning, just needed a little more time to process. He was asking me to do something I had never done in 42 years of marriage, which was to pretend to be less than I was for the sake of a strategic advantage. Harold asked you to do the same thing, Frank said quietly, reading what was in my face. Every morning for 6 weeks, he sat across from you and didn't tell you because he thought he was protecting you. I'm asking for 12 hours. The observation landed exactly where he intended it to. I did not like it. I recognized it as accurate. Fine, I said, 12 hours. Frank nodded and opened another section of his briefcase. What he placed on the table next stopped my breath for a moment. Beckett Construction Group Trust Agreement, executed 2020. I had signed this document 4 years ago. Harold had placed it in front of me on a Sunday afternoon at the kitchen table, explained that it was standard estate planning, combined with the tax optimization structure his accountant had recommended, and handed me a pen. I had read the first page in the signature block and trusted the rest of it to Harold because I had trusted the rest of everything to Harold for 4 decades, and nothing in 42 years had given me a reason to stop. Frank turned to a tabbed page near the middle and set it in front of me. The language was dense and legal, but the substance of it was plain enough once I knew to look for it. 4 years ago, Harold had transferred the majority controlling interest of Beckett Construction Group into a joint trust. The primary controlling shareholder of that trust, the person with final authority over all major corporate decisions, was not Harold. It was me, Marjorie Jean Beckett, listed by name with the specific legal weight of 4 years of documented ownership, signed before a judge filed with the county. He didn't tell you why, Frank said, because telling you why meant admitting he already suspected Clifton, and Harold wasn't ready to say that out loud to you. Not until he had proof. A pause. But he made sure you were protected before he had the proof. He built the wall first and planned to tell you about it later. I looked at my own name on the document. The signature beneath it was mine. I had signed this paper at my kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon and eaten dinner afterward and gone to bed without understanding what I had agreed to because I trusted the man who had handed me the pen. Harold had been protecting me for 4 years before either of us knew I would need it. Clifton can't finalize anything without your approval, Frank said. He has no legal path to anything. He doesn't know the wall exists. Why didn't Harold tell me? I asked, even once he knew for certain. Frank was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with the care of a man who understood that this particular answer mattered more than most. He told me if I tell her, she'll want to confront them immediately, and I don't have enough proof yet to make that confrontation go anywhere useful. He thought he was buying time. A breath. He ran out of it before he expected to. I looked at the trust document for a long moment and then turned to the last item Frank placed on the table. Another contract, longer this time with a formal header and multiple signature pages. Private Equity Acquisition Agreement. Beckett Construction Group. The purchase price listed on page 2 was $280 million. The acquiring entity was a company called Horizon Equity Group LLC. The transition clause on page 4 named Clifton Beckett as acting director who would oversee operational restructuring following the transfer of ownership. And at the back of the document, in an appendix titled Restructuring Plan Phase 1, a numbered list. Sale of fixed assets, closure of 3 ongoing long-term projects, termination of employment contracts for 270 workers within 90 days of ownership transfer. 270 people. Harold had known most of them by name. He had attended their children's graduations and signed their retirement cards and written references for their college-age kids. One of them had pressed his hand against the side of Harold's casket that morning because he didn't know what else to do with the grief. He knew what this would do to those people, I said. That's why he never signed it, Frank said, and why they needed him to. Frank's phone vibrated on the table. He glanced at the screen and answered immediately, saying very little, listening for nearly a full minute. When he set the phone down, something in his expression had shifted. That was Raymond Cole, he said. The investigator I retained 2 weeks ago when Harold first came to me. What did he find? He finished tracing the ownership structure of Horizon Equity Group tonight. Frank looked at me directly. The company was formed 18 months ago. Warren Allgate owns 35%. The remaining 65% is held through 2 shell companies. I already knew where this was going. Both shell companies trace back to Clifton Beckett, Frank said. They were not bringing in outside investors. They were the investors. They planned to purchase Harold's company using the sale price as collateral for bank financing, with Harold's own company's assessed value as the leverage to acquire it. $25 million had already been deposited into Horizon Equity as earnest money. Cole had traced the transfer. Everything was in motion. The only missing piece was my signature on a document that Clifton had told me was a routine formality. I drove home through the quiet Portland streets and went directly to Harold's study. Frank had called on the drive to tell me about Nora Finch, the chief accountant who had worked for Beckett Construction for 13 years and who Harold had approached 3 weeks before his death with a quiet and specific request to pull certain transaction records offline and preserve them. She had done it without asking for an explanation because 13 years of working alongside Harold Beckett had been explanation enough. Frank had already spoken with her. She was willing to meet the following afternoon. My phone rang at 2 in the morning. Renee. I answered on the second ring and said nothing, waiting. Mom. Her voice was different from what it had been at the reception. The professional composure was gone, and what was underneath it was harder to identify. Not guilt exactly, something less resolved, something that had not yet decided what it was going to become. I know it's late. I just needed to hear your voice. Are you worried about me, I said, or worried about tomorrow? A long silence. Both, I think. I did not press it. I said only, your father loved you, Renee. That never changed, no matter what. A sound from her end of the call, small and involuntary. Then the line went quiet and she disconnected without saying anything else. Not a confession, not a denial. The sound of someone standing at the edge of a decision they had not yet made. I put the phone down and pulled the acquisition documents toward me. It was after 4 in the morning when I reached the back of the restructuring appendix, the section no one had directed my attention to. In the lower portion of the final page in smaller print beneath the employee termination schedule, there was a deadline clause. It specified that the acquisition must be fully executed within 45 days of the date the authority transfer document was signed. 45 days from the signing. Harold had died 3 days ago. If I signed Clifton's paperwork this week, the clock would run out 2 days before the estate's formal legal process was scheduled to begin in probate court. The window in which I would have any formal legal oversight of a transaction of this size would close before the oversight mechanism activated. Frank had been focused on the forgery and the ownership structure at the diner. This clause buried in the appendix fine print had been waiting for someone who read every page to the end. Someone had engineered a timeline that depended on Harold being gone and calculated its deadline before he died. I set the document down on Harold's desk and looked at the window. The Portland sky outside was the gray that comes just before dawn, not light yet, but no longer entirely dark. A message arrived from Frank. Raymond Cole was working through the night and would have the email correspondence between Clifton and Warren Hohen by morning. A second message followed. 1 minute later, Nora Finch has records she preserved independently. Harold told her this is only useful if Marjorie sees it herself. He wanted you to hear it from her directly. I looked at that sentence for a long time. The dawn came gray and cold through the study window. I had not slept. I had read every page of every document Frank had given me, including the footnotes, including the appendices, including the legal definitions section. And somewhere in the previous 2 hours, reading at Harold's desk under Harold's lamp in Harold's chair, something had shifted in me that I did not have an immediate word for. It was not anger, though anger was present. It was not grief, though grief had not gone anywhere. It was the specific feeling of a person who has just understood the full extent of what they were asked to hold and has decided to hold it. My phone lit up on the desk at 8:30, Clifton's name on the screen. "Good morning," he said, warm and measured. "Did you sleep at all?" "A little," I said. "I was thinking I could come by around 10, just to talk." "That would be fine," I said. A brief pause. My simple agreement, without qualification, landed differently than he had planned for. "Great," he said, recovering smoothly. "I'll see you at 10. I set the phone down and looked at the photograph of Harold and Owen at the lake, both of them grinning at a fish that was embarrassingly small for the size of the smiles. 2 hours. I went to the kitchen and made coffee, strong the way Harold always made it. Then I sat at the table where he used to sit in the chair that still held the specific shape of 40 years of mornings, and I drank it slowly and thought about what I was going to say. Clifton arrived at 9:58. I had been watching the driveway from the kitchen window, and I saw him park and sit in the car for 40 seconds before getting out. I had never seen Clifton sit in a parked car without immediately opening the door. He was the kind of man who moved from task to task without pause, who treated stillness as a form of inefficiency. Those 40 seconds told me he was preparing himself in a way he felt he needed to, running through his approach one more time, adjusting his expectations for the conversation ahead. He came to the door with his leather briefcase and a careful, open expression, the expression of a son arriving to help his mother with something difficult. He was wearing the gray suit, not the black one from the funeral, which I noted, because the gray suit was the one he wore to meetings he considered winnable. "Morning, Mom." He kissed my cheek. His aftershave was the same one he had worn since his early 30s. Harold had given him a bottle of it one Christmas as a joke, something expensive and European, and Clifton had liked it genuinely and kept buying it for 15 years. Small things like that had a way of becoming unbearable at unexpected moments. I brought him into the living room. I had left the documents Frank had given me on the coffee table in a folder that looked like it might be anything. Clifton set his briefcase on the table and opened it with the click of twin latches. He removed a set of papers and placed them between us with the practiced ease of a man who had been rehearsing this moment for some time. "Just a few forms," he said. "Really, Mom, nothing complicated." "Explain them to me," I said. He looked up. He began explaining, describing the documents as operational transition instruments, standard in situations of sudden leadership change, designed to ensure continuity of active contracts. He was thorough and reassuring and completely fluent, which told me how many times he had run through this in his own mind. Halfway through his second paragraph, I said, "Who is Horizon Equity Group?" The explanation stopped. Clifton looked at me across the coffee table with his papers held in both hands. Then he set them down with the deliberate calm of a man deciding how to handle a variable he had not prepared for. "Where did you hear that name?" he asked. "Does it matter?" "Mom, I'm not sure what you think, you know. I know they want to buy this company for $280 million, I said. "I know your name is in the transition clause. I know the restructuring plan eliminates 270 positions in 90 days. I opened the folder on the coffee table and slid the acquisition contract across to him. He looked down at it the way a man looks at something that should have been locked in a drawer and is not. "Where did you get this?" he said. It came out flat, not quite a question. "Read the restructuring appendix," I said. "Your father knew every person on that termination list. Pete Garland has been a project foreman for Beckett since 1998. You shook his hand at the cemetery yesterday morning." Clifton pushed the contract to the side. He picked up his own paperwork and set it in front of me with a firmness that had not been there before. "Sign the transfer documents, Mom. The company needs operational leadership." "The company has operational leadership. Not at the ownership level, not since Dad." "Sit down, Clifton." He stopped. I had not raised my voice. I had simply shifted the weight behind it the way you shift your footing on uncertain ground, and the change was sufficient. He looked at me with an expression I recognized because I had seen it on his face when he was 9 years old and had been caught in something he had genuinely believed he could sustain. "Do you know who the controlling shareholder of Beckett Construction Group is right now?" I asked. He started to say the estate would determine that. I placed the trust document on the table between us, open to the tabbed page Frank had marked. Clifton picked it up. He read it. He read it again. His hands did not shake, but the quality of his stillness changed in a way that was visible if you were paying attention to the right things, and I had been paying attention to Clifton Beckett for 44 years. "This isn't valid," he said. His voice was level, controlled. "It was executed in 2020 before Judge Patricia Owens. Frank Aldridge has the original filing." "Dad never told me about this?" "No," I said, "he didn't." Clifton set the document down and stood up. "You can't run that company, Mom." "I don't have to run it," I said. "I just have to control who does." "And who's that going to be, Frank Aldridge?" The control in his voice was starting to show its edges. "That man hasn't been inside a construction office in 30 years. I know who Horizon Equity is, Clifton." The sentence landed and the room went quiet. "I know Warren owns 35%. I know the shell companies trace back to you. I know $25 million moved from Warren's accounts into Horizon Equity 3 months ago which means this plan was in motion before your father's last collapse. Clifton said nothing. I opened the folder to the second item and placed Dr. Prescott's email on the table beside the pharmacy receipt. I did not explain either document. I let him look at Warren's signature on the collection line and the cardiologist's written confirmation that no dosage adjustment had ever been authorized. Then I placed one additional page beside it, the deadline clause from the back of the acquisition appendix. The 45-day window calculated to expire before probate oversight began. This clause was written before your father died, Clifton, I said. Someone built a timeline that depended on him being gone. The silence that followed was the longest one since he had arrived. You've been talking to someone, he said. Yes, Frank, among others. He picked up his briefcase, put his papers back inside without straightening them, which told me more about his current state than anything he had said. He snapped the latches closed and moved toward the front door. At the threshold, he turned back. What was in his face then was not grief, and it was not remorse. It was the expression of a man recalculating, looking at a situation that has changed and trying to find a new position within it. You think you've won something here. I haven't won anything, I said. I've kept something from being lost. This isn't finished. I know, I said, but your window just closed. He left. The front door closed behind him with a firmness that fell just short of a slam, the controlled anger of a man who understood that slamming it would concede a point he wasn't ready to concede. The house settled back into silence. Outside, Clifton's car started and moved away down the street. I listened until I couldn't hear it anymore. Then I sat in Harold's chair and let myself breathe for the first time since 9:58. Then I called Frank. Renee arrived an hour later without calling ahead. She stood at the front door in a coat I had given her 3 Christmases ago, her hair pulled back without the precision she usually maintained in public. Her eyes were clear, but had the quality of eyes that have been awake since long before dawn. She came inside and sat down across from me in the living room and folded her hands in her lap. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence between us was not comfortable, but it was honest, which I found I preferred to the alternative. Clifton called me, she said. I thought he might. He's angry. I know. She looked at her hands. Mom, I need to tell you something. Not because Frank asked me to. Not because I think it changes what I did, but because I need to say it to you directly. Go ahead. Warren asked me to go into Dad's office, she said. About 2 weeks before Dad went to the hospital, he told me there might be documents in there that could complicate things for the company, and he asked me to check whether they were still where Dad kept them. A pause. I didn't take anything. I just looked. I know, I said. I saw the footage. Something moved in her face at that, not surprise. Something more like the specific relief of not having to explain a thing you have been carrying alone. Did you know it was me before last night? No, I saw it last night. She nodded. Warren told me it was standard due diligence. That Dad was being overly protective of documents that actually belonged to the company's legal record. She paused. I told myself that was probably true. Did you believe it? She looked up at me, then directly the way she had looked at me as a child when she was telling me something she knew I might not want to hear. I told myself I did. That's honest. Mom. Her voice dropped. Did Warren do something to Dad's prescription? I looked at my daughter, 40 years old. The person who had called her father every Sunday afternoon for 15 years without being asked to, not because she was performing dutiful daughter behavior, but because she genuinely wanted to talk to him. I had watched her grow from a child into someone Harold described as the best parts of both of us. Whatever she had done in that office, she had done believing a story Warren had told her, and the question in her voice right now was the question of someone who was beginning to understand what that story had covered. The investigation will determine that, I said carefully. What are you going to do now, Renee? She was quiet for a long time, long enough that I did not try to fill it. I already called a lawyer this morning, she said. My own lawyer, not someone Warren knows or has worked with. Another pause. I'm going to tell them everything I know, which isn't everything, but it's something. That will have consequences. I know. With Warren, with Clifton, I know, Mom. She met my eyes with the steadiness. I recognized the steadiness of someone who has made a decision and is accepting what comes with it. Dad used to say the right thing and the easy thing are almost never the same thing. He said that at least twice a year, I said. I used to think he was being dramatic. Something that was not quite a smile moved across her face. He wasn't being dramatic. I reached across and put my hand over hers for a moment. She did not pull away. We sat like that for a little while in Harold's living room in the house he had built our family inside of, while the October light came through the windows and moved slowly across the floor. Nora Finch arrived that afternoon with a cardboard box. She was 51 years old, compact and deliberate, with the particular economy of movement that belongs to people who have spent decades managing consequential information and learned to make no unnecessary gesture. She set the box on Harold's kitchen table and opened it the way she might have opened a quarterly report, organized, thorough, without drama. He called me on a Tuesday, she said, sitting across from me while Frank reviewed the documents she had brought. 3 weeks before everything happened. He didn't come to the office. He called my personal cell, which he had never done in 13 years. She looked at the box for a moment. He said, Nora, you've been the conscience of this company since before most of our project managers knew how to read a balance sheet. I need you one more time. She had pulled the transaction records offline that same afternoon, printed hard copies, stored them at her home. She had not told anyone because Harold had asked her not to, and because 13 years of working for Harold Beckett had given her enough trust in his judgment to act on his word alone. The records documented 14 months of financial movement, money circulating through subsidiary accounts in patterns that looked like routine operational transfers at a glance, but were not. Raymond Cole had been connecting these records to the email correspondence between Clifton and Warren, building the documented chain that would make the story of Horizon Equity legible to a prosecutor who had never heard the name Beckett before. He wanted you to hear this from me directly, Nora said, looking at me over the edge of the box. He told me if something happens and Marjorie has to deal with this, make sure she hears it from someone who was there, from someone who knew the numbers, not just from documents. I looked at her. 13 years she had sat in the offices Harold built and kept the accounts honest, and Harold had known the difference between someone doing a joy and someone bringing their conscience to it. He was right to trust you, I said. He was right about most things, she said quietly. I used to argue with him about the quarterly projections. He was always more conservative than I thought the numbers warranted. A pause. He was usually right about those too. 3 days later, Frank Mercer submitted everything to the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office. He brought me the confirmation at 8 in the morning and laid out the submission summary the way Harold might have laid out a contract, organized sequential, each item in its place. The filing included the attempted forgery evidence, the security footage, the audio recordings from Harold's desk recorder, Dr. Prescott's written confirmation, the pharmacy records with Warren's signature, the 14 months of financial documentation from Nora Finch, the email correspondence between Clifton and Warren, that Cole had obtained the complete ownership structure of Horizon Equity Group, and the deadline clause engineered around Harold's death. The acquisition contract for Beckett Construction Group was frozen by court order the following morning. Horizon Equity Group had no legal standing to proceed. The $25 million earnest money was placed in escrow pending investigation. The 270 workers whose names appeared on the termination schedule kept their jobs at least for now, and at least until the process ran its course. Warren came to the house on the fourth evening after Frank's submission. He came alone without calling ahead, and he sat across from me in the living room with the bearing of a man who has run out of strategic positions and is deciding whether honesty might serve him better than anything else he has tried. He said the pharmacy situation had been a misunderstanding. He said Harold had asked him to handle the refill because Harold had not wanted to worry me about another adjustment. Dr. Prescott's email was already on the table between us before he arrived. I let it stay there while he spoke, and after a moment, he stopped looking at me and looked at the document instead. He looked at it for a long time. When he looked up again, the exhaustion of a man who has been maintaining a fiction and has just decided he is too tired to continue, it was visible in every line of his face. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I already did it," I said. He left without another word, and I stood at the window and watched his car disappear around the corner and felt nothing in particular except a deep structural tiredness that was different from grief and different from anger, and was perhaps simply the weight of the past 2 weeks being set down. 1 week after Frank's submission, Renee appeared at his office with her own attorney and gave a complete statement. She described everything she had done and everything she had known, including the parts that reflected badly on her. She did not minimize her role. She did not assign responsibility elsewhere. Frank called me that evening to tell me, and I was sitting in Harold's study when the call came in looking at the photograph of Harold and Owen at the lake. I thought about a conversation from long ago. Renee at 15 years old coming to Harold and me before either of us had noticed anything wrong, confessing that she had taken money from Clifton's birthday card. Not because she had been caught or suspected, because she couldn't sleep knowing she hadn't said anything. Some things don't change. They get buried for a while and then the ground shifts and they come back up. Sandra brought Owen to see me on a Saturday afternoon 2 weeks after the funeral. Owen sat at my kitchen table in the chair that had been his grandfather's chair and ate the cookies Harold had kept in the second drawer on the left, which I had restocked, because it seemed important to keep some things continuous, to preserve a few of the small rituals that gave the house its shape. "Are you mad at my dad?" Owen asked. He asked it the way children ask the questions adults have been carefully not asking directly and without preamble, because he genuinely wanted to know and had decided that not knowing was worse than asking. I thought about it honestly before answering because he deserved an honest answer. "I'm sad for him," I said. "There's a difference." Owen processed this with the methodical seriousness he brought to everything. "Grandpa said something like that once. He said anger and sadness feel the same at first, but they go different directions." "He told me that too," I said, "more than once." "He said a lot of things more than once." "He did. He thought repetition was useful. He thought if something was worth saying, it was worth saying until it stuck." Owen looked at his cookie. He was right about most things. "He was wrong about the Trailblazers," I said. Owen looked up startled and then laughed. It was a real laugh, unprepared, the kind that happens before you decide whether you're ready for it. It moved through the kitchen and filled it briefly with something that belonged there, something that had been missing and had just returned for a moment. Sandra stayed after Owen went outside to walk through the garden Harold had built over 10 years, planting each shrub and tree with the patient insistence he brought to anything he had decided was worth doing. She sat across from me and held her mug in both hands and looked out at her son moving among the rose bushes. "Harold called me once," she said, "about 3 months ago, just to ask how Owen was doing in school. He asked 3 questions and then said he had to go." She paused. I didn't understand why at the time. It seemed like a strange call. "He was checking on Owen," I said, without making it obvious. That's what I thought later. She watched Owen crouch down to look at something near the fence line. He was protecting him in the only way he could at that point, making sure Owen was all right before anything happened. That was very Harold, I said. Sandra was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry I didn't do more sooner. When I found the folder in Clifton's briefcase, I knew something was wrong. I should have come to you immediately instead of waiting. You came when you were ready, I said, and you came. She looked at me steadily. I want Owen to grow up understanding what right looks like. Whatever else happens, I want him to know what it looked like when someone actually did it. We sat with that for a moment, both of us watching the boy in the garden. The boy who had carried his grandfather's last message without flinching, who had delivered it at the right moment and then waited to see what would happen next. I went to the cemetery on a morning in the third week. It was the kind of October morning that comes after the worst of the rain has passed cold and clear, with a particular quality of light that appears when the season has settled into itself and stopped pretending to be something warmer. The cemetery sat on a hillside above the city, and from Harold's grave you could see the far edge of the Portland skyline through the gap in the trees, the buildings where some of what he had built still stood and would keep standing. I brought heirloom daisies from the garden, not because they were traditional for grave sites, because they were not, but because Harold had planted them himself along the back fence the summer after Owen was born, and had been unreasonably proud of them every season since. He called them the most optimistic flowers he knew because they came back every year without being asked to, and seemed genuinely pleased about it. I stood at the stone for a while without speaking. The company is going to be all right, I said finally. Nora is staying, the crews are staying. Pete Garland told Frank he'll be there as long as the company needs him. I paused. 270 families kept their jobs. I thought you should know that specifically. The wind moved through the trees above me, dry and light. I read every page, I said, including the footnotes, including the deadline clause buried in the appendix that no one told me to look for. You would have been insufferably pleased about that trust document. 4 years and not a word. I let the quiet hold. I know why you didn't tell me. I know you thought you were protecting me until you had proof, and then you ran out of time before the proof was complete, and Frank had to finish what you started. I looked at the stone. I would have wanted to know sooner. I want you to understand that. Carrying things together was always what we did best. A pause. But I understand why you did it the way you did. You were trying to protect something you had built. You just didn't realize that the most important thing you built wasn't the company. I set the daisies against the base of the stone and stood there for a moment longer. Renee made the right choice, I said. I thought you should know that too. I walked back to the car in the clear October morning, and the city sat below me in the distance, doing what cities do, indifferent and persistent, full of people living their ordinary lives and building things that might or might not last. That evening, I went into Harold's study and closed the door. I had been avoiding the center drawer of his desk, the one he kept locked, because I had lost the key sometime in the previous few years, and Harold had always said it held nothing important enough to force. After he died, I had looked for the key in the logical places and not found it, and with everything else happening, I had left it alone. Tonight I looked in the less logical places, the back of his top bookshelf behind a row of construction codes from 1994 that no one had opened since the regulations changed. A small key on a short ring taped to the back corner of the shelf where no one would look unless they knew that Harold's less logical places tended to be more reliable than his logical ones. I opened the center drawer. Inside was a single envelope. My name was written on the outside in Harold's handwriting, pressed with the same heaviness as the note he had given Owen. I sat down in his chair and held it for a moment before I opened it. The letter inside was 2 pages. The handwriting was deliberate, the handwriting of a man who wanted every word to be exactly the one he meant, and who had probably written this more than once before he was satisfied with it. Marge, it began, I've been trying to figure out how to write this letter for about 3 weeks now, which tells you something about how difficult I find it to say the things I actually mean. You have pointed this out to me approximately 400 times over 42 years, and you have always been correct, which I am acknowledging now because I won't be there to acknowledge it in person. I spent 40 years building a company. I am proud of it. But I want to be clear about something because I don't think I have ever said it plainly enough, and plainness is apparently what letters are for. The company is not the thing I am proudest of. You are. The way you have moved through every version of our life together, the hard ones and the easy ones, and the ones that didn't turn out the way either of us planned. I watched you do it for 42 years, and I never once stopped being amazed that you chose to do it with me. If you are reading this, things got complicated in ways I could not fully prevent. I am sorry for that. I am sorry I did not tell you sooner. I kept thinking I would have more time to handle it before you needed to know, and then I ran out of time, the way people always run out of things they assume they had plenty of. That is a fault I should have corrected earlier. I am sorry. But here is what I want you to understand. I did not set up the trust because I thought you needed protecting. I set it up because I knew when the moment came, you would be the right person to hold what we built. Not because you have to, because you are the person I would choose for that responsibility out of everyone I have ever known. You were never just the person standing beside me, Marge. You were always the one holding the thing up. I should have told you that more often. Consider this me making up for lost time. Love, Harold. I sat in his chair for a long time after I finished reading. The study was quiet around me, the books he chose and the lamp he preferred, and the view through the window he had looked at for 30 years while he worked out the problems that came with building something worth keeping. Outside, the street was quiet. The neighbor's porch light was on. The city glowed faintly at the edge of the sky. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. I put the envelope in the center drawer and locked it again and returned the key to the shelf behind the 1994 construction codes. Not because I wanted to hide it, because it was where he had put it, and some things should stay where the person you love left them in the place they chose, waiting to be found by someone who knows how to look. I turned off the desk lamp. The room went dark except for the ambient light coming through the window, and I stood in it for a moment without moving. 42 years, 2 pages, a key behind a bookshelf, an 11-year-old boy at a funeral who had not flinched. He had left me a company and a set of legal protections and 42 years of mornings, and a letter in a locked drawer, and he had trusted me to know what to do with all of it. I walked out of the study and left the door open behind me. Harold had always closed it completely. But that had been Harold's habit, and this was my house now, and I thought it might be useful to let a little more light in.